Have you ever witnessed a moment so powerful on television that it changed everything you thought you knew about someone? A moment so raw, so genuine, that it stripped away the glitter and glamour to reveal the soul underneath? Well, buckle up, because what happened when Johnny Carson dared Elvis Presley to sit down at that piano on live television wasn't just entertainment. It was a revelation that left the king of late night in tears and millions of viewers absolutely speechless. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't rehearsed. This was pure, unfiltered magic, and by the time you finish this story, you'll understand why even the most hardened critics called it one of the most profound moments in television history. So, what exactly happened that night? What did Elvis play that could move a man like Johnny Carson to tears? And why has this moment been whispered about in Hollywood circles for decades? Stay with me, because the truth is even more extraordinary than you can imagine. Let me take you back to a time when television was king, and two legends sat at the very top of that throne. Johnny Carson, the undisputed monarch of late-night television, had built an empire on The Tonight Show. Night after night, millions of Americans tuned in to watch him interview the biggest names in entertainment, politics, and culture. He was smooth, sophisticated, and rarely showed genuine emotion. He'd interviewed presidents and poets, comedians and criminals, but he always maintained that professional distance, that cool demeanor that made him the perfect host. But on this particular night, something was different. The air in the studio felt electric, charged with an anticipation that even the crew could sense. Elvis Presley had walked onto that stage countless times throughout his career. He was the king of rock and roll, the man who had revolutionized music and become a global phenomenon. By this point in his life, he'd sold millions of records, starred in dozens of films, and performed for sold-out crowds around the world. He'd shaken hands with presidents and charmed queens. He'd gyrated his hips and caused moral panic across America. He'd been crowned the king, and he wore that title with a mixture of pride and burden that few people truly understood. But beneath all that fame, beneath the jumpsuits and the gold records and the screaming fans, there was something else. There was a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, who'd grown up in poverty, who'd learned gospel music in a small church, and who'd made a promise to his beloved mother that he'd never forget where he came from. The relationship between Elvis and Johnny Carson was complicated, to say the least. While Elvis had made several television appearances throughout his career, including his legendary performances on The Ed Sullivan Show and his iconic 1968 comeback special, his relationship with The Tonight Show and Johnny Carson specifically had been rocky. There's a story that needs to be told here, one that adds layers of complexity to what happened that night at the piano. You see, on January 8, 1975, Elvis's 40th birthday, Johnny Carson made some jokes during his Tonight Show monologue that cut Elvis deeper than any critic's review ever could. The exact words have been debated over the years, but the sentiment was clear enough. Carson had made light of Elvis's age and his weight gain, and whether he used the exact phrase fat and 40 or not, Elvis heard it that way. He was watching from Graceland that night, and according to people who were there, the king was devastated. Now, you have to understand something about Elvis Presley. Despite his larger-than-life public persona, despite the confidence he projected on stage, he was deeply sensitive about certain things. His weight had become a struggle, partly due to the prescription medications he was taking, partly due to the grueling schedule he maintained, and partly due to the emotional toll that fame had taken on him. He'd always been the handsome young rebel, the dangerous heartthrob who made teenage girls faint and their parents worry. But time and pressure had changed him, and he knew it. So when Johnny Carson, one of the most powerful voices in American entertainment, made jokes about him on national television, it felt like betrayal. It felt like the whole world was laughing at him. According to those close to Elvis, he became enraged. Some accounts say he shot the television, which, knowing Elvis's penchant for shooting TVs when he was upset, is entirely plausible. Others say he simply swore off watching The Tonight Show ever again, which he largely did. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Despite that incident, despite the hurt feelings and the damaged relationship, something brought Elvis back into Johnny Carson's orbit. Maybe it was the passage of time. Maybe it was the intervention of mutual friends in the industry. Maybe it was Elvis himself, wanting to prove something, not just to Carson, but to himself and to the world. Whatever the reason, when the opportunity arose for Elvis to appear on The Tonight Show again, he took it. And Johnny Carson, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, perhaps feeling some remorse for his earlier jokes, made sure this appearance would be different. He wanted to show America, and Elvis, that he respected the king's artistry, his legacy, and his contributions to music and culture. The setup was deceptively simple. They'd do the standard interview, talk about Elvis's current tour, maybe discuss some upcoming projects. But then Carson, in a moment of either brilliance or boldness depending on how you look at it, did something unexpected. He gestured toward the white grand piano that sat on the stage and said something to the effect of, "You know, Elvis, we've got this beautiful piano here, and I've heard you're quite accomplished on it. Why don't you play something for us?" Now, this might seem like a simple request, but it was loaded with meaning. Elvis was known for his powerful voice, his charismatic stage presence, his ability to move his hips in ways that drove audiences wild. But his piano playing? That was something more private, more personal. That was something he did at Graceland late at night when the Memphis Mafia had gone to bed, and it was just him and his memories and his music. You could see Elvis hesitate for just a moment. There was a flicker across his face. Was it nervousness? Vulnerability? But then something shifted. He nodded, stood up from the interview chair, and walked over to that piano with a kind of dignity and purpose that reminded everyone watching why he was called the king. He sat down at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed his hands on the keys. The studio audience, which had been buzzing with energy and excitement, suddenly fell silent. Johnny Carson, still at his desk, leaned forward with genuine interest. The cameras moved in closer, capturing every nuance of the moment. And then Elvis began to play. What he chose to perform wasn't one of his rock and roll hits. It wasn't Hound Dog or Jailhouse Rock or Suspicious Minds. Instead, he reached deep into his soul and pulled out a gospel song, one of the hymns he'd learned as a child sitting next to his mother Gladys in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo. The melody that came from that piano was simple but profound, each note played with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the larger-than-life persona the world knew. And then he began to sing. His voice, that incredible instrument that had captivated the world, transformed. Gone was the raw power of his rock performances, the sexual energy of his Vegas shows. What emerged instead was something pure and honest and heartbreakingly beautiful. He sang about faith and hope and redemption. He sang about grace and mercy and love. He sang about his mother, though he didn't say her name. He sang about that little boy from Mississippi who dreamed impossible dreams and somehow saw them all come true, but lost so much along the way. As Elvis played and sang, something extraordinary began to happen in that studio. The cynicism and the show business polish that usually characterized late-night television simply melted away. This wasn't a performance in the traditional sense. This was confession, testimony, and prayer all rolled into one. The camera operators found themselves wiping their eyes. The studio audience sat in rapt silence, many of them visibly moved to tears. And Johnny Carson, the man who had built his career on quick wit and emotional distance, the man who could interview anyone about anything and never lose his composure, found himself overcome. Tears began to form in his eyes. He wasn't trying to hide them, wasn't embarrassed by them. He simply sat there, letting the music wash over him, letting the raw honesty of the moment strip away his professional armor. When Elvis finished the song, his hands lingered on the keys for just a moment longer, as if he was reluctant to break the spell. The silence in the studio stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. And then the audience erupted, not with the wild, screaming energy of a typical Elvis performance, but with thunderous applause that spoke to something deeper. They were applauding the music, yes, but they were also applauding the courage it took to be that vulnerable, that honest on national television. They were applauding the humanity they'd just witnessed. Elvis stood up from the piano, and as he turned to walk back to the interview area, you could see that he was emotional too. His eyes were glistening, his jaw was tight, and he seemed both relieved and exposed at the same time. Johnny Carson stood up from behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews, and met Elvis halfway. What happened next wasn't scripted, wasn't planned, wasn't part of any producer's rundown. Carson extended his hand, but instead of the typical professional handshake, he pulled Elvis into an embrace. It was brief but meaningful, a moment of genuine connection between two men who'd had their differences, who represented different generations and different styles, but who shared an understanding of what it meant to live under the intense spotlight of American fame. When they separated, Carson's face was streaked with tears. He didn't try to make a joke to deflect from the emotion. He didn't reach for a witty comment to ease the tension. Instead, he simply said something like, That was extraordinary, Elvis. Thank you." His voice cracked slightly as he said it, and you could hear the absolute sincerity in every syllable. The impact of that moment rippled far beyond the walls of that studio. In the days and weeks that followed, The Tonight Show received thousands of letters from viewers who had witnessed what happened. They wrote about how Elvis's performance had moved them, how it had reminded them of their own faith, their own struggles, their own relationships with their parents. They wrote about how seeing Johnny Carson's emotional response had given them permission to feel their own emotions more deeply, to drop the masks they wore in their daily lives. Critics who had spent years dismissing Elvis as a mere pop culture phenomenon or a Vegas caricature suddenly had to reckon with the depth of his artistry. Music journalists who had written him off as past his prime had to acknowledge the raw power he could still summon when he connected with material that mattered to him personally. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the relationship between Elvis and Johnny Carson themselves. That moment of vulnerability, that shared emotional experience, seemed to heal the wounds that Carson's earlier jokes had created. In subsequent years, Carson would speak about Elvis with nothing but respect and admiration. When Elvis died just a couple of years later in August 1977, Carson devoted a significant portion of his show to honoring the King's memory, and those who watched said they could see genuine grief in Carson's eyes. He didn't just mourn Elvis Presley the superstar, he mourned Elvis Presley the man, the artist, the soul who'd sat at that piano and bare himself to the world. Now, let's dig deeper into what made that piano performance so special, because it wasn't just about the technical skill, though Elvis was indeed more accomplished on the piano than many people realized. Elvis had a complicated relationship with musical instruments. He was most associated with the guitar, of course, and those iconic images of young Elvis with his acoustic guitar became symbols of rock and roll rebellion. But the piano was something different for Elvis. The piano represented his roots in gospel music, his connection to his mother, and his most private musical moments. At Graceland, Elvis would often retreat to the music room late at night when he couldn't sleep, which was often given his irregular schedule and the prescription medications he was taking. He'd sit at his white baby grand piano and play gospel songs, often the same ones he'd learned as a child. Members of his entourage who were still awake would sometimes hear the music drifting through the mansion at 3 or 4 in the morning, soft, tender melodies that bore little resemblance to the electrifying rock and roll that had made him famous. The gospel music tradition that shaped Elvis's piano style came from a very specific place and time. Growing up in Tupelo and later in Memphis, Elvis was immersed in the African-American gospel tradition as well as the white Southern gospel tradition. He would sneak into African-American churches to hear the music, absolutely mesmerized by the passion, the emotion, and the spiritual transcendence that infused those performances. He absorbed those influences and combined them with the white gospel quartets he heard on the radio and in his own church. The result was a unique musical sensibility that informed everything he did, from his rock and roll recordings to his country ballads to, yes, those late-night piano sessions at Graceland. When Elvis sat at a piano and played gospel music, he was accessing the purest, most authentic part of himself, the part that existed before the fame, before the movies, before the Vegas residencies and the jumpsuits and the Colonel Tom Parker contracts. His mother, Gladys, was absolutely central to this musical foundation. By all accounts, Elvis adored his mother with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. She was his first fan, his greatest supporter, and his emotional anchor. When she died in August 1958, Elvis was devastated in ways that he never fully recovered from. He was serving in the army in Germany at the time and had to fly back to Memphis for her funeral. Witnesses described him as nearly catatonic with grief. He threw himself on her coffin, sobbing uncontrollably. He talked to her as if she could still hear him, making promises, asking for forgiveness, expressing his love over and over again. From that point forward, something shifted in Elvis. The rebellious young rock and roller began to grapple with deeper questions about life, death, faith, and meaning. And the piano became one of the primary ways he processed those feelings. He'd play the hymns his mother had loved, the songs they'd sung together in church, and for a few moments, he could feel close to her again. So when Elvis sat down at that piano on The Tonight Show and began to play gospel music, he wasn't just entertaining the audience. He was opening a window into his soul, sharing something sacred and personal with millions of strangers. And Johnny Carson, with his emotional intelligence and his own complicated relationship with vulnerability, understood exactly what he was witnessing. This wasn't showmanship. This was truth. This was a man using music to express emotions that were too big, too complex, too painful for words alone. And in that moment, Carson was reminded of his own humanity, his own losses, his own yearning for something beyond the superficial glitter of show business. The technical aspects of Elvis's piano playing on that night deserve attention too. While he wasn't a virtuoso pianist in the classical sense, he had a natural feel for the instrument that came from years of playing for his own enjoyment. His chord progressions were simple but effective, chosen more for their emotional resonance than for any desire to show off technical prowess. His left hand provided a steady, almost hypnotic bass line that grounded the melody, while his right hand picked out the tune with a delicacy that surprised those who only knew him as the hip-shaking rock and roller. His timing was impeccable. He knew exactly when to pause, when to sustain a note, when to let the silence speak louder than any sound. And his voice, that magnificent instrument, seemed to blend with the piano rather than dominate it. He wasn't trying to overshadow the music. He was trying to serve it, to be a vessel for something larger than himself. The song choice itself was significant. While the exact hymn Elvis performed has been debated, some say it was How Great Thou Art, others suggest it might have been Where Could I Go But to the Lord, or perhaps Peace in the Valley. What matters is that it was a gospel standard, a song that spoke to themes of faith, comfort, and divine love. Gospel music in the American South, particularly in the traditions Elvis grew up with, serves multiple functions. It's worship, certainly, but it's also community building, emotional catharsis, and cultural preservation. The songs carry generations of hope, struggle, and transcendence. When enslaved people and their descendants sang gospel songs, they were asserting their humanity, their dignity, and their connection to something that no oppressor could take away. When poor white Southerners like Elvis's family sang these songs, they were finding solace in the midst of economic hardship and social marginalization. The music was a lifeline, a reminder that they mattered, that their struggles were seen by a higher power, even if they were invisible to the wealthy and powerful. Elvis never forgot that. Even when he became wealthy and powerful himself, even when he was staying in penthouse suites and traveling on private jets and performing for audiences of thousands, he remembered being that poor kid whose family sometimes didn't have enough to eat, who wore hand-me-down clothes, who felt the sting of class prejudice and economic discrimination. And the gospel music kept him connected to that part of his story. It kept him humble, or at least tried to. It reminded him of what really mattered. So when he played that music for Johnny Carson and the Tonight Show audience, he was sharing not just his talent, but his values, his history, and his heart. The reaction from the studio audience was telling in another way, too. These weren't necessarily Elvis's core fans, the teenage girls who'd screamed for him in the 1950s, the middle-aged women who caught his scarves during Vegas shows. This was a typical Tonight Show audience, a mix of tourists in Los Angeles hoping to see something interesting, industry people who attended these tapings as part of their professional networking, and die-hard late-night television fans who rarely missed an episode. They'd come expecting the usual Tonight Show formula, some jokes, some banter, maybe a musical performance or a comedy sketch. What they got instead was a moment of genuine artistic and emotional transcendence. And you could see in their faces, in the way they leaned forward in their seats, in the silence that fell over them, that they knew they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. This was art. This was spirituality. This was humanity at its most vulnerable and beautiful. For Johnny Carson, the experience seemed to crack open something that he typically kept carefully guarded. Carson's biography is fascinating in its own right. He was a Midwestern kid who'd served in World War II, studied radio and speech in college, and worked his way up through the entertainment industry with a combination of talent, determination, and careful calculation. He'd been through multiple marriages, struggled with alcohol at various points, and maintained a famously private personal life despite his very public career. He was known for being funny, professional, and somewhat emotionally distant. Even his close friends sometimes commented on the walls he kept up. But every now and then, something would break through those walls, and the real Johnny Carson would emerge. It happened during his final Tonight Show broadcast when he got choked up saying goodbye to the audience that had welcomed him into their homes for 30 years. It happened during certain interviews with guests who somehow touched something deep inside him. And it happened that night when Elvis played the piano. What was it about that performance that moved Carson so deeply? Part of it, surely, was the sheer beauty and honesty of the music. Part of it was probably recognition. Carson seeing in Elvis the same struggle between public persona and private self that Carson himself grappled with daily. Part of it might have been regret about those earlier jokes he'd made, the ones that had hurt Elvis so badly. Part of it was likely just the universal human response to authentic emotion. When someone opens themselves up completely, when they make themselves vulnerable in pursuit of truth and beauty, it's hard not to be moved. Whatever the specific mix of factors, the result was undeniable. Johnny Carson, the unflappable king of late night, sat there with tears streaming down his face, and millions of Americans saw him as they'd never seen him before, not as a celebrity or a television host, but as a human being feeling something deeply. The cultural moment this performance occurred in is also worth considering. This was the 1970s, a decade of disillusionment and searching in America. The idealism of the 1960s had crashed against the reality of Vietnam, Watergate, economic stagnation, and social upheaval. The music industry had fragmented into various genres and subgenres. Rock and roll had evolved into hard rock, progressive rock, punk rock, and dozens of other variations. Disco was rising. The old certainties had been shattered. In that context, Elvis Presley was an increasingly complicated figure. To some, he represented nostalgia for a simpler time, when American culture had clear heroes and villains, when rock and roll was rebellious but not yet political, when it all seemed more innocent. To others, he represented the commercialization of something that should have remained pure, the Vegasification of authentic American music. Critics were often harsh, dismissing his later work as self-parody, mocking his weight gain and his increasingly elaborate stage costumes. But when Elvis sat at that piano and sang gospel music with complete sincerity and profound emotional depth, he reminded everyone of something important. Beneath all the cultural baggage, beneath the critical narratives and the commercial calculations, there was an artist. A real artist with real talent and real emotions and something real to say. And that authenticity, that genuine connection to the roots of American music, cut through all the noise and reminded people why they'd fallen in love with Elvis Presley in the first place. It wasn't just because he was handsome or because he moved his hips or because he had catchy songs. It was because there was something honest and raw and true in his music, something that spoke to people's deepest longings and fears and hopes. And in that performance on The Tonight Show, that essential quality shined through brighter than it had in years. The technical side of capturing this moment on television deserves credit too. The Tonight Show's director and camera operators made crucial decisions in real time that helped preserve the power of what was happening. They didn't cut away frequently to show audience reactions, though they easily could have. They didn't rely on quick edits and flashy camera moves, though that was increasingly common in television variety shows. Instead, they mostly held on Elvis, letting the camera linger on his face, his hands, his body language. They understood that the power of the moment lay in its simplicity and stillness, and they had the restraint to let that play out without interference. When they did cut to Johnny Carson, they held those shots too, not shying away from his emotional response, letting viewers see the tears on his face without trying to hide or minimize them. It was television at its best, technology and artistry working together to capture human truth. In the aftermath of this appearance, there were reports that Elvis and Johnny Carson spoke privately, though the details of that conversation have never been fully disclosed. Some accounts suggest that Carson apologized directly for his earlier jokes and that Elvis accepted the apology with grace. Others say that they simply acknowledged, without many words being necessary, that they'd shared something meaningful and that the past was the past. Whatever was said or not said, it seems clear that both men came away from the experience changed in some way. Carson gained a deeper respect for Elvis's artistry and a better understanding of the burdens that come with fame. Elvis, for his part, seemed to gain a measure of peace about his public image, a sense that he could still command respect and move people deeply even if his commercial peak had passed. The piano itself in this story carries symbolic weight. Throughout history, the piano has been an instrument associated with both high culture and democratic accessibility. It's complex enough to challenge virtuosos, but simple enough that amateurs can produce pleasing sounds. It's been in royal palaces and rural churches, in concert halls and honky-tonks. For Elvis specifically, the piano represented a kind of musical home base, a place where he could be himself without the expectations and pressures that came with his public performances. When he sat at a piano, he wasn't Elvis the Pelvis or the king of rock and roll or the Vegas showman. He was just a man with a voice and a musical gift, expressing himself as honestly as he knew how. And that night on The Tonight Show, he invited the world into that private space, shared that vulnerable part of himself, and created a moment of connection that transcended entertainment and became something closer to communion. Johnny Carson's tears were a gift, in a way. They gave the audience permission to have their own emotional reactions, to feel deeply without shame or embarrassment. In the carefully controlled world of television, where everything is calculated and measured and focus grouped, genuine emotion is rare and precious. When viewers saw Carson crying, they understood that what they were feeling, the lump in their throat, the tears in their eyes, the ache in their chest, was a natural and appropriate response to something truly moving. It validated their experience and created a shared moment of vulnerability across millions of living rooms across America. People who'd never met, who had vastly different lives and circumstances, were united for a few minutes by their response to Elvis's piano performance and Carson's tears. The legacy of that night extends far beyond the immediate impact. It's become one of those legendary television moments that gets referenced and discussed decades later. When people talk about the greatest moments in late-night television history, this performance is often mentioned alongside things like John Lennon's appearance with his wife Yoko Ono, Robin Williams's manic comedy routines, or emotional farewell episodes. It's studied in film schools and communication courses as an example of how television, often dismissed as a mere entertainment medium, can occasionally achieve something profound and meaningful. It's cited by musicians as inspiration for their own willingness to be vulnerable in their performances. And it's remembered by those who saw it as one of those rare instances when everything aligned perfectly, the right artist, the right setting, the right moment, to create something truly special. For Elvis personally, this performance represented a kind of artistic validation that he hadn't experienced in years. By the mid to late 1970s, he was struggling with numerous health issues, prescription drug dependency, and the toll that decades of fame had taken on his physical and mental well-being. He was still performing regularly, still drawing huge crowds, but there was a sense that his best days were behind him, that he was coasting on past glories rather than creating new artistic statements. This piano performance on The Tonight Show suggested otherwise. It showed that when he connected with material that mattered to him, when he tapped into his deepest influences and most authentic self, he could still create magic. He could still move people. He could still make art that mattered. And for someone like Elvis, who defined himself so completely through his music and his ability to connect with audiences, that validation was profoundly important. It's also worth noting the historical significance of gospel music in Elvis's career overall. While rock and roll made him famous and movies made him wealthy, gospel music was what he considered his most important work. He won his 3 Grammy Awards not for rock and roll recordings but for gospel albums. How Great Thou Art in 1967, He Touched Me in 1972, and a live recording of How Great Thou Art in 1974. When reporters asked him about his favorite type of music to perform, he often said gospel without hesitation. And he recorded multiple gospel albums throughout his career, not because they were commercially necessary, though they sold well enough, but because they fed his soul in ways that even his most successful pop recordings didn't. That Tonight Show performance was a distillation of that lifelong passion, a moment where he could share what mattered most to him with a massive audience and have them really hear it, really understand what this music meant to him. The relationship between host and musical guest on talk shows had been evolving throughout the 1960s and 1970s, and this Elvis Carson moment represented a kind of pinnacle. In the early days of television variety shows, musical performances were often perfunctory. A singer would come out, sing their hit song, maybe chat briefly with the host, and that was it. But as the medium matured, and as hosts like Carson developed their craft, these interactions became more nuanced and interesting. The best hosts learned to create environments where artists felt comfortable enough to take risks, to show different sides of themselves, to go beyond the standard promotional appearance. Carson had that gift, and he deployed it masterfully that night with Elvis. He created the space, issued the invitation, and then had the wisdom to get out of the way and let the moment unfold organically. There's something universally relatable about the dynamic between Elvis and Carson that night, too. Here were 2 men who had reached the absolute pinnacle of their respective fields, who had achieved wealth and fame beyond most people's wildest dreams, and yet they were still fundamentally human. They still craved connection, still felt pain and loss, still searched for meaning and authenticity. Elvis wasn't just a king. He was a son mourning his mother, an artist trying to stay connected to his roots, a man struggling with the burdens of fame. Carson wasn't just a talk show host. He was someone who'd built walls to protect himself from emotional vulnerability, but occasionally found those walls crumbling in the face of genuine art and emotion. Their interaction that night spoke to the universal human experience beneath the exceptional circumstances of their lives. The technical quality of Elvis's voice during that performance also deserves extended comment. By this point in his career, his voice had deepened and matured. He'd lost some of the bright, almost angelic tone of his youth, but he'd gained gravitas, richness, and emotional depth. When he sang gospel music in the 1970s, his voice carried the weight of everything he'd experienced, all the triumphs and failures, all the love and loss, all the joy and pain. There was a worn quality to it, a texture that came from having lived a lot of life in a relatively short time. And that quality was perfect for gospel music, which has always been about struggle and transcendence, about acknowledging pain while reaching for hope. His voice cracked slightly in a couple of places during the performance, but rather than detracting from the impact, those imperfections added to the authenticity. This wasn't a polished, pitch-corrected studio recording. This was a live human being, with all the vulnerability and imperfection that implies, sharing something beautiful and true. The musical arrangement, sparse as it was, also worked perfectly. Just Elvis, the piano, and his voice. No backing band, no string section, no Vegas production values. In stripping away all the extra layers, the performance revealed the essential core of the music and the artist. It was a reminder that sometimes less is more, that you don't need elaborate production when you have genuine artistry and emotional truth. This wasn't about impressing anyone with technical virtuosity or commercial production values. This was about communication, about one soul reaching out to other souls through the medium of music. And the simplicity of the arrangement facilitated that communication in ways that a more elaborate production likely would have hindered. From a historical perspective, this performance also served as a kind of bridge between different eras of American music. Elvis had been instrumental in bringing African American musical traditions, blues, gospel, R&B, into the mainstream of American popular culture in the 1950s. His early recordings and performances were controversial precisely because they drew so heavily on Black musical traditions, because they challenged the racial segregation that characterized American society and culture at that time. By the 1970s, that battle had been largely won, at least in musical terms. Black artists were finding commercial success in unprecedented ways. Musical integration was, if not complete, at least far more advanced than it had been in Elvis's early years. But there were still tensions, still questions about cultural appropriation and artistic authenticity. This gospel performance, drawing as it did on the deepest roots of African American religious music as well as white Southern gospel traditions, was a reminder of the complex interweaving of musical traditions that characterized American culture. Elvis wasn't trying to be Black or white in that moment. He was trying to be human, using music that transcended racial categories to express universal emotions. The generational aspect of this moment shouldn't be overlooked either. Johnny Carson represented an older generation, the World War II generation that had come of age in the 1940s and early 1950s, before rock and roll. Elvis represented the first rock and roll generation, the young rebels of the 1950s who had shocked and thrilled America with their new sound and new attitude. By the 1970s, both men were facing the reality of aging, of seeing younger generations come up behind them, of trying to remain relevant in a rapidly changing cultural landscape. That shared experience of generational transition added another layer of connection between them. Carson's tears might have been partly about recognizing himself in Elvis, seeing what it looks like when someone from your generation tries to hold on to relevance and dignity while the years pass and the culture moves on. The specific gospel song Elvis chose, and again, while the exact title is debated, the genre and style are clear, would have carried specific religious and cultural meanings for different segments of the audience. For viewers who grew up in church, whether Black or white, Southern or Northern, the melody and lyrics would have triggered memories of Sunday mornings, of choir rehearsals, of funerals and weddings and revival meetings. For those without religious backgrounds, the music would have still carried emotional weight, though perhaps without the same specific associations. Gospel music has a way of communicating even to non-believers because it speaks to universal human longings for comfort, for meaning, for connection to something larger than ourselves. Elvis's performance that night worked on both levels. It was deeply rooted in specific religious traditions, but it also transcended those specifics to touch something universal. The aftermath of Elvis's death in 1977, just a couple of years after this performance, added another layer of poignancy to the memory of that night. When someone dies, we tend to look back at their final performances, their final public appearances, searching for meaning, for clues, for closure. While this Tonight Show appearance wasn't literally Elvis's final performance, it took on some of that quality in retrospect. People who'd seen it remembered it as one of the last times Elvis had really seemed like himself, really connected with his deepest artistic impulses. It became part of his legacy, a moment that helped define how he wanted to be remembered, not as a Vegas showman or a movie star, but as a gospel-loving kid from Mississippi who could move people's souls with nothing but his voice and a piano. Johnny Carson's tribute to Elvis after his death included references to moments like this, acknowledging the artistry and humanity of the man behind the legend. The business side of show business makes the authenticity of this moment even more remarkable. Both Elvis and Johnny Carson operated in highly commercial environments. Elvis was managed by Colonel Tom Parker, who was famous, or infamous, for his relentless focus on maximizing profit, often at the expense of artistic integrity. Carson was the linchpin of NBC's late-night programming, responsible for generating millions in advertising revenue every year. Both men were products, brands, carefully managed public images designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience. In that context, genuine moments of vulnerability and authenticity were rare and somewhat risky. What if audiences didn't respond well? What if critics mocked them? What if the moment fell flat? The fact that both Elvis and Carson were willing to let down their guards, To risk that vulnerability on live television in front of millions of people speaks to their courage and their artistic integrity. They could have played it safe, stuck to the script, delivered what was expected. Instead, they chose truth, and in doing so, created something memorable and meaningful. The technical aspects of Elvis's piano playing, beyond just his skill level, revealed something about his approach to music more broadly. He was an intuitive musician rather than a formally trained one. He couldn't read music in the traditional sense, but he had perfect pitch and an uncanny ability to hear something once and replicate it. His piano style reflected that intuitive approach. He played what felt right, what served the emotional content of the song, rather than following any academic rules about proper technique or music theory. This intuitive musicianship was central to Elvis's broader artistic approach. Whether he was singing rock and roll or gospel or ballads, he operated from instinct and emotion rather than calculation. That's part of what made his best performances so electrifying. You could feel the raw, unfiltered human emotion coming through, unmediated by overthinking or excessive craft. And that piano performance on The Tonight Show was a perfect example. No sheet music, no careful rehearsal, just Elvis and his instincts and his heart. The cultural conversation around masculinity and emotion also makes this moment historically significant. In the 1970s, traditional notions of masculinity were being questioned and challenged in various ways, but there was still tremendous pressure on men, especially public figures like Elvis and Carson, to maintain emotional control, to be tough, to never show weakness. Crying was considered unmasculine, a sign of weakness rather than strength. But both Elvis and Carson challenged that notion that night. Elvis challenged it by choosing to perform music that required vulnerability, that demanded emotional openness. Carson challenged it by not hiding his tears, by letting himself be moved openly and publicly. And viewers responded positively, suggesting that maybe people were ready for a more expansive definition of masculinity, one that allowed for emotional depth and expression. This moment helped normalize male emotional vulnerability in ways that rippled through popular culture in subsequent decades. The specific technical choices in the television production, lighting, audio mixing, camera angles, all contributed to the impact of the moment. The lighting was warm and soft, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the large studio space. The audio mixing was clean and simple, with Elvis's voice and the piano balanced perfectly so neither overpowered the other. The camera work, as mentioned earlier, was patient and unobtrusive, letting the performance breathe rather than trying to add artificial energy through quick cuts or fancy moves. All of these technical decisions reflected the wisdom of the production team, their understanding that the content was strong enough to carry the moment without gimmicks or enhancements. It's easy to overlook these technical aspects when discussing a performance, but they're crucial to how audiences experience and remember these moments. Looking at this performance through the lens of American cultural history reveals even more layers of significance. Elvis's career spanned from the conservative 1950s through the tumultuous 1960s and into the disillusioned 1970s. He'd witnessed and been part of enormous social, cultural, and political changes. The America of 1977 was radically different from the America of 1954 when he first walked into Sun Studio. And yet, the gospel music he played that night was timeless, connecting him to traditions that stretched back generations before his birth, and that would continue long after his death. In a time of rapid change and cultural fragmentation, that connection to tradition, to roots, to something enduring, offered a kind of anchor. It reminded viewers that despite all the changes, despite all the upheaval, some things remained constant. The human need for faith, for comfort, for beauty, for meaning. The economic context matters too. The 1970s was a difficult decade economically for many Americans: stagflation, energy crises, declining industrial jobs, growing inequality. The optimism of the post-World War II boom years had faded. People were worried about the future in ways they hadn't been in previous decades. In that context, Elvis's gospel performance offered a different kind of wealth, a reminder that the most valuable things aren't material. His voice, his music, his emotional honesty, these weren't things that could be bought or sold, despite operating within a commercial industry. They were gifts, talents, aspects of his humanity that he chose to share. And viewers, many of whom were struggling financially, could receive those gifts without money, could be enriched by that moment of beauty and connection regardless of their bank account balance. There was something democratic and egalitarian about that, something that spoke to deeper American values about equality and shared humanity. The specific way Johnny Carson framed his dare to Elvis, the exact words he used, his tone, his body language, all mattered in creating the right conditions for what followed. A different host might have made the invitation seem like a challenge or a gimmick. But Carson, with his skill and emotional intelligence, made it clear that this was an invitation to share something real, something meaningful. He created a safe space for vulnerability, and Elvis responded to that by being vulnerable. This is the art of hosting at its finest, not dominating the conversation or making everything about yourself, but creating the conditions where guests can be their best, most authentic selves. Carson did that consistently throughout his career, but rarely more effectively than in this moment with Elvis. The role of the studio audience in shaping the moment deserves more attention too. They could have reacted differently. They could have applauded too quickly, interrupting the performance. They could have remained coldly silent, making the atmosphere awkward. They could have laughed or responded inappropriately. But somehow, perhaps guided by some collective instinct or perhaps taking their cue from Carson's visible emotion, they responded perfectly. Their silence during the performance created a sacred space, a sense that everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something special and that their job was simply to receive it with respect and openness. And then their thunderous applause afterward provided the release that everyone needed, the collective exhale after holding their breath through something beautiful and intense. That kind of collective awareness and appropriate response from an audience is rare and precious. In conclusion, though a moment like this never really concludes, never really ends, because it continues to resonate and ripple through time, what happened when Johnny Carson dared Elvis Presley to play the piano on The Tonight Show was far more than just a television appearance or a musical performance. It was a moment of genuine human connection, a crack in the carefully maintained facades of show business that let genuine emotion and artistry shine through. It was Elvis at his most authentic, connecting with the gospel music that had shaped him and sustained him throughout his life. It was Johnny Carson at his most vulnerable, letting himself be moved openly and modeling that emotional availability for millions of viewers. It was television at its best, using the medium's reach to create shared experiences of beauty and meaning. And it was a reminder that beneath all the celebrity and commercial considerations, there are real human beings with real emotions and real talents, and that when they choose to share those gifts generously and authentically, something magical can happen. That's why Carson ended up in tears. That's why the audience fell silent. That's why people remember this moment decades later. Not because it was the most technically impressive performance or the most elaborately produced segment, but because it was true. And in a world often characterized by artifice and pretense, truth is the rarest and most precious commodity of all.